Hey, King Solomon is doing all right. I always wanted to come against the church for doctrines of demons and the worship of those, and the lascivious living as well as the license to sin, because grace is not really afforded there and you guys are in sin. I talked about it a little in A Few Good Men. I put it in one of the quotes. I put one of the scriptures, or the scripture, and the Lord warned me not to talk about it on YouTube. It was going to be my central message. Doctrines of demons in the churches destroying God's people was going to be the number one message, besides discipleship and sanctification. I've never even gotten into my testimony. Just a little bit. I did one video, but that's not my full, it's just a little bit of it. Here's the point. Because God would not allow me to come against doctrines of demons in the churches in 2011 on YouTube, I couldn't create a foundation where I showed how hypocritical and how sinful this church actually was. Jesus Christ simply would not allow it. It's the truth though. Just because Jesus doesn't allow it doesn't mean it's not the truth. It's always been the truth. I just wasn't allowed to speak on it. Here's the thing. Had I been allowed to speak on it, then the church would have recognized pretty quickly that your license to sin within grace was 300 to 8 million, not 8 million, but probably around 8,000 times worse than King Solomon. That's why I say King Solomon's doing all right. I pointed out in a video, in some writings, that King Solomon was handed grace on a silver platter. He was handed understanding, yada, yada, yada. It's beside the point, because had I been allowed to preach what I wanted to on YouTube, that the church within their doctrines of demons was basically having a license to sin, was sinning and was using grace as a license to sin, and I couldn't even preach against it. Well, but if I preached it that the church was using it as a license to sin, then the church would have recognized pretty clearly that you guys were offenders horrifically under grace, that you guys were using grace horrifically. Did King Solomon use grace horrifically? No, not at all. In fact, it was God's decision to grant him understanding for free. So he didn't do perfect with it. Some might argue he did average with it, but it's not really the point, because God has never given you permission to have demons, and God's never given you permission to sin under grace. He's just not calling you on it in a certain way. So the church is much, much, much more guilty than King Solomon, at least 30 to 8,000 times more guilty. So King Solomon's doing all right. And had I been allowed to bring up the church rather than King Solomon, I don't even think I would have talked about King Solomon unless I was forced to, unless I had to use an example. And it's throughout scriptures that if you have to use examples, that sometimes that's where you have to go. But I would not have done it with any ill intent toward King Solomon, because the grace afforded to this church was so grotesque that you would have known via my preaching that you shouldn't even look at King Solomon regarding anything, because your sin was so rampant. You cannot sin under grace like that and point the finger at anybody else. So that is my take on it. King Solomon's doing all right. He's beaten this church 30 to 800 times over, 8,000 times over. And there's no room for you guys to reason that. If something occurs, then you're still guilty of sin. It doesn't make any difference. It simply doesn't. You know, God lets things happen. He doesn't allow it. He lets it. And just because God lets something happen doesn't mean he won't judge it. And this church is deceiving itself to believe that because I wasn't allowed to preach it, that everything's going to be all right. It's not. This church is always going to give an account for how lascivious they lived under grace and sin, and that you guys did it a certain way without repenting, without acknowledging scripture, without acknowledging the gospel, without acknowledging the work God was trying to do to save your souls and to sanctify you and disciple you in him. And this is necessary. It's necessary you understand this, because I don't want anybody to quickly blame me for trying to throw King Solomon under the bus. As far as I'm concerned, the truth should have been known in 2011, and this church would have had no place to reason. You guys would have known how guilty you were. You know, you would have known. And if I brought King Solomon up, it would have been an afterthought. and none of you would have had any spirit to try to bring him down. And I certainly wouldn't have brought him down, because I think he absolutely did way better than this church. And I knew that long before YouTube. I knew that this church was more guilty than King Solomon. I just wasn't allowed to preach it. So there you have it.